In order for a torpedo exploding under a ship hull to damage or destroy the ship, it must break the structural form of the ship. There must be a breach, damage, to the structural form of the ship. If you look at an Arleigh Burke destroyer, a rough model is a ship 70 feet wide, 600 feet long, and 15 feet of draft. That would produce a ship of something over 8,000 tons displacement, which is about the loaded displacement of an Arleigh Burke destroyer. The longest pathway for the gases to venting is when the torpedo is in the center of the hull. It's 35 feet to the edge of the hull, it's 15 feet to the surface. At that point, the gases will vent, and the pressure under the hull will return to the normal pressure. If it's 50 feet of pathway to the side of the ship, it's also 50 feet front and back. So the longest possible pocket you can create with a torpedo exploding under the hull is 100 feet long, give or take. Let's look at the torpedo. Torpedo has about 600 pounds of explosive. The value for explosive is about 1.6 million pound-feet of energy per pound of explosive. So for 600 pounds, that's about 1 billion pound-feet of energy. Formula for expanding a sphere under constant pressure is the volume of the sphere times the pressure. You're starting off with a surface area, but as you expand it out, you get the volume. And that's the final volume minus the initial volume. The initial volume for 600 pounds of explosive is about 6 cubic feet. That can be pretty well ignored. If you're looking at 30 feet under the water, the pressure is 2,000 pounds. 30 feet times 64 pounds per cubic foot. Now you're assuming it's a uniform pressure, which it's not, obviously. It's because with the depth, the pressure changes. But at 30 feet with 2,000 pounds, the volume of a sphere is 4/3 pi r cubed. That's roughly 4 r cubed. Pi is 3.14. With 1 billion pound-feet of energy, 2,000 pounds per square foot of pressure, the number you get is 500,000. Divide by 4, you get 125,000. The cube root of that is 50. It's a 50-foot radius, a 100-foot diameter ball, 30 feet under the water. Now, obviously, the surface is 30 feet high, so it can't get to 50 feet because it'll hit the surface and it'll burst. If it's under a ship, it'll be somewhat blocked and it'll expand a bit more. As the bubble expands, heat is transferred into the water. There is compression of the water, which will result in heating. There's also the temperature difference between the explosives and the water. That transfer of heat into raising the temperature of the water means that there's less energy available for expanding the bubble. In shallower water, it will theoretically have a larger diameter, but it will reach the surface faster and it will burst faster. So a torpedo, you're looking at a ball of, again, about 100 feet diameter. If you wanted a bubble large enough to swallow the whole ship, it would have to be 600 feet in diameter. That's 6 times as large, and by scaling, you would need a cube. 6 times 6 times 6, which is 216. 216 times 600 pounds of explosive, you would need well over 100,000 pounds of explosive. It would also have to be far enough below the surface that it doesn't burst at the surface before the ball is formed. The explosive would have to be detonated 300 feet or more under the water to form a ball of that size. Explosions underwater do overexpand. They expand past the equilibrium point of the pressure inside the ball and the seawater. And the reason for that is momentum. And the momentum of the ball expanding carries it past the equilibrium point, at which point it cannot sustain that volume because the pressure inside is too low to balance the pressure forces of the ocean. And so it contracts, and it overcontracts. And then it expands again and it contracts again. That pulsing sound is how they detect explosions under the ocean. They hear that pulsing sound, and that indicates an explosion. The ball is also lighter than seawater, and so it rises while it's pulsing. On a torpedo, you're not going to get much more than a 100-foot diameter ball. If you wanted to go to even 150 feet, by scaling, it would be 1.5 cubed, which is about 3.4. So you need to increase the explosives from 600 pounds to about 2,000 pounds of explosive. And also, for it to form without bursting at the surface, it would have to be detonated below 75 feet of depth. It is difficult for any ship for a gas bubble under the hull to be much longer than the width of the hull. If it happens towards the bow of the ship, the gas bubble will actually be smaller because it will vent faster. Ship hulls must be designed for extreme wave conditions. The Navy tries to avoid storms On YouTube, you can find a video of an Arleigh Burke model ship being tested in a towing tank with simulated storm waves. The bow of the model is coming out of the wave with a length that appears to be about 100 scale feet. This actually happens in wave motions with ships. The bow comes out and it is supported only by the bending moment of the hull. It has to be able to resist those forces. The waves in that video are not really that huge, and yet the bow is still coming out of the wave and needs to be self-supporting. This is a rough model of an Arleigh Burke destroyer with waves that are 50 feet high and 1,400 feet long, kind of big waves that you would see if you get close to a hurricane. In the trough of the wave, the ship is supported fore and aft by the water, but in the center, the water level is below the normal waterline. The hull is not being fully supported by the water, which means it has to be supported by the beam bending of the entire ship hull. When the ends are high and the middle is low, that is called sagging. As the ship drives through the wave, a short time later, the crest of the wave will be at the center of the ship. The center of the ship will be supported, and the ends will be unsupported, and they will bend down, and this is known as hogging. Ship hulls are designed for these wave conditions. If a bubble 100 feet long was enough to break a ship hull, that same ship hull would get snapped in half the first time it went through storm waves. For a beam bending on a uniform load, the formula is the load per foot times L squared, the length of the beam, and then you multiply that by a number. If the ends of the beam are built in, the number is 1/12 for the maximum moment. If the ends are free, they're only vertically supported, pinned or free connection, that is 1/8. So it's a number between 1/8 and 1/12. The Arleigh Burke destroyer is 15 feet of draft. That's times 64 pounds per foot for seawater, that's 1,000 pounds. Times 70 foot width the ship is 70,000 pounds. Now, it's not uniformly distributed. Depending on loading, it can vary from place to place. If you want to see it's even 100,000 pounds, you then take the 100, square it, 10,000, pick a number, let's say divide by 10, that's 1,000, multiply by the 100,000 pounds per foot, and you get 100 million. The section depth of the ship has a 15-foot draft and another 15 feet to the deck level. That's 30 feet. You divide the 100 million by 30, and you're getting 3.2 million pounds of force necessary to balance the beam loads. In addition, the structures on top of the deck could be part of the structural system. Have to be careful how you build them. There's a danger of stress concentrations where they join the deck if you're doing that. But that would give you an even deeper section. Structural steels with which ships are made are pretty good steels. The steel is used for buildings and bridges, that is garbage steel. That has a yield point, the point at which it starts stretching like taffy, of about 50,000 pounds per square inch. The steels used in ship hulls have over 100,000 pounds before they start to stretch. In compression, the problem is buckling. And the buckling load will determine the point at which you have maximum loading. The goal is to get the buckling load close to the yield load. And that is why you have framing and stiffeners. It is to brace it so that it does get closer to the yield load before it buckles. If you're saying even 40,000 pounds of allowable load, you have 3.2 million, that's 80 square inches of material that you need. If the plating is half an inch thick, which it's usually thicker than that, that's 160 linear inches, or 13 feet. The hull is 70 feet wide. A 100-foot wide void created by the explosion of a torpedo is not enough to damage a ship hull. The ship would drive right over it and keep on going. Even a 150-foot hole, which would require 2,000 pounds of explosive, would not be enough to damage a ship hull. The reason why a torpedo damages the ship hull is it breaches the hull. It breaks the shell plating, the structural membrane of the ship. That is why when torpedoes are sent to attack ships, they try to get underneath the ship, but barely underneath the ship. They want to be as close as they can to do as much damage as possible to the hull. Now, when you have a voidal space, what happens is that hull is irregularly shaped. You have jagged edges. At those jagged edges, you get stress concentrations where the forces are much higher than the average force. That can cause a crack, and the crack can propagate. As the crack propagates, it reduces the sectional strength of the ship hull, further allowing the crack to propagate. That can cause the ship to split in half. All of this only happens if the shell plating of the ship is destroyed locally. If that is prevented, the torpedo exploding under the ship hull will not damage the ship. The explosives in a torpedo have low brisant, high impulse. Brisant is the ability to shatter. That requires an explosive to be in intimate contact with the object it is destroying. Torpedo explosives produce impulse, that's force integrated over time. What they do is they push in the hull, and they keep on pushing and pushing until they burst open a section of the hull. A torpedo has a sonar dome on the front end. That is the way it hunts a ship and is able to attack the target. The explosives have to be in back of that. To use a brisant explosive, you would have to have it in intimate contact with the hull. There's no effective way of doing that. So you have to use the impulse. You have to get a maximum amount of force over time to crush and rupture the hull of a ship. If that is prevented, they become ineffective. A small penetrating injury of a hull can be patched. You may leak fuel, it's not a good idea. Eventually you're going to have to do serious repairs on it, but the ship can keep on going because ships are large objects. You need to do a gross amount of damage to it. The goal of a torpedo is to sink the ship or stop the ship. And that requires destruction of the shell plating of the ship, which can be prevented with suitable crushable materials.